Welcome to the IAPP web conference, Vendor Management, Assuring Data Privacy and Security Compliance, brought to you today by SecurityScorecard. My name is Dave Cohen. I'm the IAPP's Knowledge Manager, and I'll be your host for today's program. We'll be getting started with the presentation in just a minute, but before we do, I want to cover a few quick program details. Participating in today's program will automatically provide IAPP certified privacy professionals, or the named registrants, with 1 CPE credit. Others who are listening in can apply for that credit through an easy-to-use online form on our website. We'd also like to remind you that today's program is being recorded and will be provided free to registered attendees approximately 48 hours following the live event. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during the program by typing them into the Q&A field to the right of your PowerPoint window, and your questions will be answered by the presenters at their discretion either during or after the presentation. And now on to our program, and I would like to introduce today's panelists. Sam Kasumi is Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of SecurityScorecard. Sam, welcome to the program, and can you tell us a little bit about your professional background?
Thank you for having me. This is Sam speaking. As Dave mentioned, I'm COO and co-founder of SecurityScorecard, which is an information security startup based in Manhattan, New York. Prior to founding Scorecard, I spent my entire career as a chief security officer and information security practitioner by trade. I've grown and scaled security, risk, compliance, and privacy programs from the ground up, both at large enterprise organizations as well as high-growth SMBs.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Sam, and welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us today. Joining Sam on the panel, Derek Morford is manager, as a matter of fact, just recently senior manager, as I understand it, Information Security Vendor Management for Allstate. Derek, welcome, and can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the field of information security?
Dave, thank you for having me. Prior to this role, I spent about 12 years in IT audit. The past 2 years, I transitioned to information security, managing the supplier security risk management team and partnering with our privacy peers.
Terrific. Welcome, Derek. It's great to have you. And to round out our panel today, Adriana Novielli is Manager of Privacy for Allstate and works alongside Derek. Adriana, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this post and your current duties?
Sure, Dave. Thanks for having me. Prior to my role in privacy, I had stints in both external and internal audit in the corporate accounting field, but have pretty much remained in the compliance type role throughout my career and landed in privacy around 6 years ago here at Allstate.
Fantastic. Welcome, Adriana. It's nice to have you with us. And so with that, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the program. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam. Sam, the virtual floor is all yours.
Great, thank you. I'll start off by sharing a thought and a reflection that I was having recently. Throughout my entire career, I always felt like I had pretty good control and visibility into my own security, health, and performance, the security of the companies that I was working for. But there was one thing that always kept me up at night, that I would literally stay up at night losing sleep over. I would lay in bed thinking to myself, are my vendors, are my supply chain partners doing at least as good of a job as I am in protecting my data? And this is a seemingly innocent question, but it's a very difficult and complex question to answer. The traditional tools and methods that I was using fell short, and I used to think to myself, really throughout every role I had, there has to be a better way. Now, there's an old English proverb, we're only as strong as our weakest link. And that appears to be the case as it relates to breach incidents. At SecurityScorecard, we observe a tremendous amount of information security signals. And one of the latest trends that we're observing is we're seeing that today, over 70% of breach incidents originate from a third party. That means hackers are no longer trying to directly attack a company, but they're looking at the vendors and partners of the company as a method of entry. Internally, we call it, sometimes we call it breach by association or hacked by proxy. And oftentimes we don't find out about this until it's too late. We receive this dreaded phone call from our partner that says, we've been hacked, and unfortunately your data was involved. And our customers don't really know the difference. To them, a breach is a breach. They trusted us with the information, and it was lost. And we see these breach by association events taking place in a couple of different ways. The first way we see is exfiltration. Hackers are getting our data from somebody else. The other way that we see hackers attacking is through penetration. Hackers are using the weakest third parties as a jumping point into the network. We see lots of companies, Target was a great example, where their HVAC heating and cooling vendor had a persistent network connection into the Target stores, and hackers use that connection as a jumping point to wreak havoc. So, one question that we talk about often is, how did we get here? When and how did this issue become so unmanageable? So I'd like to provide some context to help understand where we've come from and what we believe is required to move forward. We talk a lot about what we call a paradigm shift that we're observing taking place, from traditional fortress model to what we see today, which is the ecosystem model. Let's talk about those two models and what's changed. In the fortress model, which has been the traditional model up until probably the early 2000s, companies for a long time operated in a fortress. That means all the data, all the transactions, everything was contained within the four walls of the business. We owned all of the data centers. We even owned the real estate that the servers sat on. And we would invest and hire full-time employees to manage and monitor these systems. And in the fortress model, security practitioners had the tools and the resources that are required to maintain broad spectrum control of the data. I mean, thinking back throughout my career, I can recall many times sitting and eating lunch with my peers who were sysadmins and database administrators, and we would talk about how to improve security control. In fact, we were architecting oftentimes the systems and the blueprints, and we knew where the crown jewels lived. Usually they were located in some centralized location that allowed us to build layers of control around the data in order to protect it and compartmentalize any breach incident or intruder. This model has changed. What we're seeing now is this ecosystem model, as we call it. The ecosystem model is really just a hyper-connected business-to-business operation. Everybody is a vendor, and everybody is dependent on somebody else to get something done. And why did that happen? Well, we saw usually we saw in the mid-90s or so, hardware costs dropped. Servers and storage became cheaper, and that gave advent to cloud computing. In cloud computing, cloud services or software as a service is essentially turnkey, outsourced operational service or process that's offered at a fraction of the price of traditional overhead and monitoring. And we observed CFOs and COOs celebrating and embracing the cloud. Operators and folks that were looking at the bottom line said, hey, this is an opportunity for us to reduce our overhead and lower our operational costs. And also, there was a very positive net effect for employees. Employees felt more empowered because we were decentralized. We were no longer, chained to our desk and our desktop. We had our mobile devices, and we could work from anywhere. And that also meant that the data that we were handling was also located everywhere and decentralized. And while the CFOs and the operators celebrated this as a cost savings, for folks like us, the security officers or risk officers, frankly, it was a bit of a nightmare. The data that we used to have control and visibility over was now being thrown into what seemed like a black hole. And the traditional tools that we used in the fortress model fell short. Traditional security tools, they sort of simulate a hacker attack. And the intent there is to find an issue or a vulnerability before a hacker does. Now, we're authorized to run these tools on our own infrastructure, but we're usually not allowed to simulate a hacker attack on a company that we don't own or operate without some type of prior permission. And that's how we became only as strong as our weakest links. And when we think about risk management, it's not only third-party risk management, but it's really ecosystem risk management, because we use third parties, but those third parties, they don't operate in a fortress or a vacuum. They use third parties as well. and those companies use third parties and so on. And many times, a third party that we use is also used by our peers and partners, which can create a systemic risk within our ecosystem. For example, we host data in Amazon, and probably all of our third parties and their third parties do as well. And if Amazon goes down, we lose operational control. Now, when I think back to my career as a CISO, I had two KPI indicators that I was being held accountable to, and I'm sure folks on the phone will agree. There's usually two things. One is zero data breach incidents. We cannot ever have a breach incident at the company. And the second KPI is zero data loss incidents. We cannot have any data leaking out of our organization. And CISOs are being held accountable to these KPIs irrespective of where the data lives. Now, this is manageable when we control everything, when we control the keys to the kingdom. But when we rely on others that are outside of our scope of control, it creates visibility and transparency gaps that make driving accountability so much more difficult. So why is it so hard for us as security, risk, compliance, or privacy practitioners to perform this due care, to establish controls which help prevent a breach by association from occurring? Well, simply put, IT is a rapidly changing target. What we observe and audit today could very easily change tomorrow. And when I look at the industry, it feels like we've established some fairly reasonable controls so far, but these controls have limitations. Since we can't use our traditional security tool set to run continuous simulated hacker attacks or stress tests on our partners because that's not allowed, we turn to our auditors and regulators for advice. And in the mid-90s, auditors came back to us and they said, look, follow in our footsteps and use traditional audit controls. Now, these are good practices, but unfortunately they don't keep up and they don't scale. In order to keep up with a continuously changing environment, we really need continuous monitoring tools. So what do we use today? What do we see folks using in the market? Well, the most traditional method is questionnaires. And unfortunately, questionnaires fall short. We're trusting the answers that somebody's putting on paper, but it's really, really difficult to verify that what they're providing us is honest and accurate. And to take it a bit further, there's a bit of a bias in questionnaire responses. Imagine we're filling out a questionnaire. I have many times in the past, and I'm sure folks on the line have as well. There's a bit of a conflicting feeling. On one hand, we want to be open and honest about our security controls and performance, but on the other side, we also want to help increase the speed of business. If there's a deal that's waiting to get done that's dependent on a healthy questionnaire and there's millions of dollars on the table, well, do I just want to get this done over with so we can close the deal and help the business, or do I want to be honest but risk disrupting getting the deal done? We also see point-in-time assessments and evidence provided, but those assessments can be problematic because what's true today or what was true yesterday may not be true tomorrow. Compliance evidence is also good, but again, it's dated, and compliance evidence doesn't equal security. Now, I'm not saying that this information shouldn't be collected. I very much encourage folks to continue sending the questionnaire, getting the assessments, getting the audit evidence. These are good keystone collateral to collect when doing the assessment, but it's simply not enough. And the other thing that this does is that it turns the risk management team oftentimes into the no department. And I never liked feeling like the no department. Somebody comes to you and says, can I do business with this vendor? And you come back and you say, look, as a practitioner, I don't recommend you use this service. Well, that unfortunately doesn't help the business move faster. If anything, it trains our peers on the business side to circumvent the control and to figure out ways to do business faster without funneling through the security and risk teams. We also find that accountability is really, really tough to drive after the fact. We've signed a contract or an MSA, now what? And we ask our peers and our customers, what happens after you sign the contract? Most people say, look, I put the paper in the filing cabinet and I sort of pray to God that this company never gets hacked. And then after a few months, I forget about it. Some companies have a more robust process, and they say, we bake in the right to audit in our contracts. But let's say we have the right to audit, and we scan or assess our vendors, on a quarterly basis, and you find an issue. We hear that getting our partners to remediate and fix problems is next to impossible. Our customers tell us, vendors and partners come back and say, why should we? We already signed the contract. I have no obligation to fix this, or we only do deploys once a year, so we'll get to that in December. And as a practitioner, it feels like we've lost the leverage to drive accountability. So how can we break free from this cycle and empower ourselves? I think the first and one of the most important points to recognize is the answer is not another tool or another solution, because look, you're going to talk to Gartner or go to an RSA conference, and every vendor out there is going to say, if you only had our product or service, that bad thing that you experienced would have never happened. But unfortunately, traditional tools don't really address the complications or the complexity of the VRM lifecycle. I think we need to forget about the tools and solutions and start focusing on capabilities. What are the capabilities required to have a high-velocity, resilient VRM program? So let's talk about what we believe some of those capabilities are. One, we think what would be really helpful for practitioners is almost to have like a pair of, think about X-ray specs. Like you want to put on X-ray specs so you can see where all of the bad things live in any company that you do business with so that you can hold them accountable. We also need the capability of detecting bad events before they happen, not after. And that means having the capability to become more proactive. Unfortunately, over 80% of the tools that we see in the market are reactive, and they stop less than 5% of attacks. And the key here is to catch signals and indicators that increase the likelihood of a breach before the breach incident occurs. We also need the capability to de-risk our ecosystem. And that means we need to be able to answer the question by having one of our partners fix a specific issue or by switching to a more secure vendor. How much does it de-risk the likelihood that we're going to get breached? We also need the capability to know who are the companies within our vendor and partner ecosystem which are substantially pulling down or drawing down our security. Let's say I have 10 vendors, for example. If I have 10 vendors, what is the distribution of the good vendors versus the bad vendors? Which ones are increasing my risk? We also believe that we need to be empowered with the capability to increase the speed of business and empowering teams to become not the no department, but the yes department. Rather than saying, no, we don't recommend that you do business, we want to provide the ability to provide alternative, comparable solutions instead of just saying no. And last, we feel it's very important to be able to have the capability of speaking a common language that the business can understand. Non-technical folks don't really understand things like exploits and vulnerabilities. They understand good risk versus bad risk. They understand likelihood or cost of a breach. But they generally need information to be explained in a way that's easily understood across all departments. And with that being said, I'm now going to hand it off to Adriana to talk more about how information security intersects with privacy.
Thank you, Sam. Before I begin, I just want to remind the participants that they can submit questions at any time by typing them in the field to the right of the PowerPoint presentation that they see on their screen. So I'm going to be walking you through the process that we currently have, the model that we use here at Allstate. And prior to this model, we had a very decentralized approach to assessing privacy and security risks. And similar to how Sam was talking earlier, that led to a very reactive versus a proactive process. And it was really contingent upon the individuals to recognize when to engage the privacy or information security teams, which was not the ideal model for Allstate to be operating. Ways in which you can change that is to understand the ultimate goals or objectives of your programs. How do you envision seeing privacy and information security fitting into that overall vision? Another question to ask is, what's your organization's overall risk appetite or tolerance? And then be sure to get your senior leaders or leadership buy-in and alignment. Articulate why it's important for them to evaluate the privacy and security supplier risks. Don't be that no department like Sam was saying. If they understand why it should be important to them and the risks of inappropriately evaluating the risk or not doing it at all, they're more likely to support the process and to use it. And then successful programs can measure effectiveness and communicate those results. It's important to be able to evaluate and define success. The development and implementation of a supplier risk management program shouldn't be a static or once-and-done activity. You should be continually revisiting it and reviewing it to identify any potential improvement opportunities and to accommodate any emerging risks or changes in the regulatory landscape that you're seeing. And then finally, don't be afraid to seek help. Benchmarking can be a very powerful and effective tool to not only design, but then to also refine your organization's program. So Allstate's supplier risk management process was designed to align to industry best practices. The program integrated the privacy and security assessment functions within the overall end-to-end procurement process. This helped to expand our focus also beyond just the personally identifiable information or protected health information, but also to consider and evaluate other risks of sharing other types of information, like undisclosed financial information or intellectual property, those crown jewels that Sam was speaking about earlier, with any third parties. In addition, our program enhanced the contract terms, and we were aligning better to the scope of the products or services that were being outsourced, as well as to industry best practices. So prior to executing any new supplier agreement, Allstate evaluates those privacy and information security risks with that data exchange. We take action where possible to mitigate those risk exposures by embedding ourselves within that process early on. The information security risk assessment, as we refer to it, is just one component of a more complex and overall risk management framework. The end-to-end process for us begins with a business area engaging procurement with a potential sourcing opportunity. The business area completes what we call a business analysis questionnaire, which has trigger questions embedded within it and can trigger up to 6 different risk assessments for completion. Each assessment is based on certain responses to that BAQ, or business analysis questionnaire. The information security risk assessment is just one of those 6 assessments, and once completed, it's jointly reviewed by our privacy and our information security teams. Additionally, the supplier in this arrangement receives an information security questionnaire, or an ISQ, for completion. That document is how we evaluate the control landscape or environment at the supplier location. And although a supplier is used, you must ensure that you're holding the supplier to that same standards and level of controls that your organization would expect to protect that information or data. Once completed, the information security questionnaire is received and reviewed by our information security team, and any relevant findings that are identified are tracked for remediation. I'm going to hand it off to Derek to talk a little bit more in depth about the business analysis questionnaire, the information security risk assessment, and that information security questionnaire.
Thank you, Adriana. She did a really good job speaking at the high level. I'd like to bring it down now another level and really walk you through how Allstate did this. But first, let's start off with the scope of the supplier population. Allstate has approximately 11,000 suppliers. Of those, approximately 350 suppliers have our data. So when you start putting that into perspective and knowing that, as Adriana mentioned, every statement of work goes through this process. We want to know where our data is at all times, and we want to risk assess them. So how do we do it? as Adriana was saying, we start with a BAQ, a business analysis questionnaire. It's really simple. It's 10 questions. We use this to scope the engagement. We want to delineate, is it someone who will be cutting the grass, or is it someone who will be receiving our data? If you answer yes to any of these questions, you will automatically receive an information security risk assessment. It's called information security risk assessment, but it's also privacy related. Within the ISRA, there's 28 questions. Now we're going to start drilling down on your first response. For example, in the BAQ, you mentioned we will be sharing data. Well, now in the ISRA, with the 28 questions, we want to know what type of data. What we are focused on at Allstate is PII, PHI, intellectual property, financial data, and a really important one that Sam touched on, access to our network. We want to identify every supplier who is going to have direct access to the network. The business completes the information security risk assessment, and automatically, as the business is filling this out, it's risk ranking that supplier. We currently use the nomenclature critical, high, medium, or low. So as they're answering the 28 questions, we use Archer, but we've also designed this in Excel. You can use either one. Archer is doing a risk calculation based off of how you're responding. That will drive two things. The information security questionnaire that Archer will automatically send to the supplier. If you're a critical supplier, we will send 169 questions. If you're a low-risk supplier, you'll get approximately 70 questions to be completed. But the second piece of that risk ranking is we want to know what suppliers we will be doing an on-site security assessment at. Currently, all of our suppliers receive an annual on-site security assessment. In the future, we're going to scale that back to only critical and high, and then maybe medium will receive a WebEx review, and low, maybe a questionnaire. So this is the process that drives the end-to-end onboarding of a supplier. As we've grown, and as Adriana, our procurement, and my team have matured this process, I wanted to share with you some of the speed bumps we've encountered. And we're learning about contracts being an issue. At Allstate, we include with any master service agreement, professional service agreement, we have a 12-page addendum to the contract that covers privacy and security-related items. I've seen several companies who just have about a paragraph, more like, you must protect our data. If it's PII, you should do this. We've taken it that extra yard. We have 12 pages of every privacy control you must adhere to and every information security control you have to adhere to. Annually, we review this privacy, my team, procurement, we review it with legal. Over the past year, we came up with a different approach. When I started this slide, I was saying we add 12 pages to the addendum. It caused a minor problem because information security controls are constantly maturing. Privacy requirements are constantly changing. When it's attached to the contract, you have to renegotiate that contract. So we've changed our approach this year. We now put all of these documents on allstate.com. In the contracts, we reference these standards and put in a clause where you're agreeing to this version and future versions of it. It's been very beneficial because, you know, with 300 suppliers, if we need to make a change of privacy or information security, we can't go and renegotiate 300 contracts. Now this allows us to just update our standards and just post them back up on allstate.com. Most importantly, through this journey, what we've learned is Adriana spoke about senior leadership buy-in. We have buy-in all the way to the board of directors. Our CEO is actively engaged in this process. Our CISO has been a great sponsor of this. But what you need from your leadership is their support. If you raise a red flag, that they will support you to say, walk from the contract. In the past, years ago, we would spend time partnering with suppliers. We still do. But if we're seeing significant incidents or you don't want to comply with something, we will find another supplier. Our leadership no longer tolerates privacy incidents or security incidents. We will walk from the contract. So the next piece, we are a customer of SecurityScorecard. I believe we started with SecurityScorecard about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And how it came to light, the board, which was actively involved in this process, asked an external auditing firm. They made the general comment, we want an assessment of our information security controls, and we want that assessment within a week. Well, everyone knows that's impossible, but what the consulting firm did was a week later, they brought back a security scorecard report. At that time, our CISO saw it, saw the value in it, and then we later purchased that to monitor our own suppliers. But the key point, you know, monitoring's one piece. I was speaking to a friend at another company. They learned about WannaCry, that ransomware, from CNN. Allstate learned about WannaCry spreading automatically from SecurityScorecard. We're not reliant on the news. We try to get in front of vulnerabilities. They'll automatically alert us of WannaCry or Petya ransomware. From this, we think we're 8 to 10 hours ahead of everyone else. This allows us to start getting communications out to our suppliers. We see a lot of value. We monitor, we have alerts set up. When a supplier score drops, we're alerted from SecurityScorecard. We then have a defined process to trigger through their product a communication to the supplier asking them to address these vulnerabilities SecurityScorecard identified. This adds value. If someone's security score is declining, it implies their security hygiene is weakening. When that occurs, your data is at risk. That's your PII, PHI intellectual property. When we see a score declining, we're already moving through the process. I'm communicating with Adriana, procurement, senior leadership at Allstate. We're giving everyone heads up that we're detecting this, and now we're taking proactive steps. With this, we've actually built relationships with our suppliers. Often what SecurityScorecard is detecting, they weren't even aware of. So when we're reaching out to suppliers to say, please address this, we often get, thank you. We didn't know that vulnerability existed. That's protecting our data. It's a great product. We see a lot of value. Our leadership loves it, and we'll continue to use it. So the last thing I want to talk about is kind of leading into that, and speaking, over the past 2 years, the challenges and how we've matured our process. In order to have that end-to-end visibility into all your suppliers, you must first start with an accurate repository. An accurate repository means, are they an active supplier? What data elements do they have? Do you have a correct way to contact them? An email address, the phone number. Something we've learned recently with WannaCry and Petya, the email addresses in our repository, that's the salespeople. When we're sending communications asking if they were affected, the salesman would say, well, I don't know, but I'll forward it to my information security team. We're now changing. We're having a field added in Archer to now capture, in the event of an incident or where privacy needs to contact you, we now have an email address, the right person this communication should go to. But also building that supplier relationship, we conduct performance reviews. Everybody goes through, personally, everyone goes through a performance review. This is no different. These are supplier reviews. We sit down with our suppliers and we have a scorecard of how did you do on an onsite? How are you protecting our data? We also go into, were invoices timely? The supplier sits across from the table from you. They get a score, A, B, C, D, or F. We're motivating our suppliers to get that A grade. In approximately 1 year, we're ultimately going to start driving business to our A and B suppliers. It makes no sense if a supplier is underperforming that we're rewarding them with business. And then most importantly, don't forget, the business owns the relationship. You have to keep them engaged and informed. They have to have a seat at the table. If, like I mentioned with the security scorecard, we see it declining, I'm notifying the business leadership. If it keeps declining, I'm looping in my boss, the CISO. But ultimately, the business needs to address this. That's all I had. Dave, turning it back to you for questions.
All right, terrific, Derek. Thanks very much, and thanks to all three of you for that. And we've got a number of great questions in the queue here, and so I'm just going to dive right in and start offering them up. Let me combine one that we've received from a couple different people, and that has to do with scope and scale for you, Derek and Adriana, in terms of the size of your team there at Allstate. And the question has to do with how big is the team that works on these vendor contracts and the monitoring of them, et cetera. So just can you give folks out there a little sense of scale of what the workload is there and what resources you guys have in-house to be able to deal with them?
Sure, Dave. I'll take it first. On the privacy side, we actually have a pretty small team. There are 4 full-time resources that are dedicated to what we call our privacy operations, which include the review of the supplier risk management processes.
And this is Derek. From a supplier security risk management side of it, we have 8 FTEs, and then for the on-site security assessments that I mentioned, we outsource those to a consulting firm.
Terrific. That's helpful. Hopefully people can think about the size of their organizations and the concurrent workload. There are a couple questions that touch on this as well. It has to do with the back and forth in the contracts and negotiations, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit more, either Derek or Adriana, about what happens if a vendor is not able to check a box on a requirement, or is told that they need to come up to snuff. Is there a lot of back and forth in the contract negotiations, and do vendors actually go back in-house and clean up their act and add additional arrangements and then come back and get the contract or get dropped? And what happens if they can't check that box? Is Allstate really firm and just moves on and finds another vendor? Are they really strict about that? Can you speak a little bit more in detail
Sure.
on that process?
It's actually a great question. It's not just contract related. I was speaking about the information security questionnaire. That's that upfront due diligence. This is occurring way before the contract is hitting legal's desk. We're already assessing their information security controls. If there's gaps, like you mentioned, we will document those gaps in a risk assessment and send it back to the business. Again, they own it. They need to assume the risk. I say that with kind of an asterisk. If it is if we overall assess that it's a critical risk, or the entire process is going to stop and we're going to start over. That's where the CISO will get involved. If we overall assess it as critical, that means they have gaping holes in their security posture. We will stop the process and start the procurement process all over again. If it's medium or high, we will circle back to the supplier. Sometimes we notice that they answered the question wrong. Other times we will partner with them to see if there's a compensating control that can be implemented. If it's low risk, we will meet with senior leadership and just kind of tell them, there was a gap. We don't see it as a big concern. All we ask with any of what I described is senior leadership in the business to sign off on the risk to proceed. So that's that upfront piece. The contracts piece, the ISAS, the information security standards for Allstate suppliers, that's that 12-page document I was referring to. We have gone through a lot of red lines. The supplier will try to redline a lot. Often it's just a game, a contract game between two attorneys. Come end of the day, we will ultimately say, you're really close to being rewarded this contract. We will walk from this and go find another supplier. All of a sudden you see those red lines really disappearing quickly. Hopefully that answers your question. Up front, we do a risk assessment. We document it in a report. On the back end with the contract, we really let legal, they'll make the call. If they have gaps, then we're not proceeding.
Terrific. That's really helpful, Derek. Does, I think, answer the question well. And as a sidebar to this question, we had another question that came in on which areas of the organization participate in the supplier review, procurement, business, or privacy security. I want you to just think on that a minute. I want to turn back to Sam now, but I might come back to that if you have any, and if you want to talk a little bit more about who exactly within the organization gets involved in that kind of supplier review. But before we go there, I'd like to pull Sam back into the conversation here and ask him, Sam, if you could comment on this. How is the security scorecard incorporated into the critical suppliers assessment process? Would you like to comment to that?
Absolutely. And I would split that question into two tracks. We have security scorecard integrated into the pipeline of vendors that we're thinking about working with, and then we have security scorecard integrated on the post-contract assignment signature once we sign the MSA, the continuous monitoring side. Let's talk about the assessment pipeline first. At a kind of a broad stroke level, we see customers still asking for the same traditional evidence as part of the process, questionnaire, pen test results, etc. In parallel, they're going into security scorecard and pulling up the scorecard report for that organization. Super simple. Enter the name or URL of any company that you're doing business with, and instantly, within a few seconds, they get back the report. Now, as Derek mentioned, we start off with very high-level letter grades, A through F. The letter grades can be unpacked into specific areas of concern, and those areas of concern, whether it's the website security, application security, network security, and so on, can be further unpacked to identify the specific issues or areas of risk that are causing the score to not be perfect. We see customers using the letter grades as directional indicator as to how much resource they should invest. So, for example, if a company has an A or a B, maybe the 10 questionnaire screener is enough, and we don't have to send somebody on site. But if they have a C or a D, we need to send them the 400 question questionnaire, and we need to send one of our practitioners to perform an on-site audit. And if they have an F, well, maybe we don't do business with them. Maybe we look at alternative, like competitors or alternative solutions which provide the same value that have a better grade. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes our customers will say, look, if you have a C or a D, we simply ask you to fix your issues and get to a better grade before we do business, so they can drive some of the accountability there. Once a contract has been signed, security scorecard is used to keep continuous watch and continuous monitoring of the vendors and partners. So generally speaking, when customers sign on to security scorecard, they usually pre-populate the platform with hundreds or even thousands of vendors that they've been doing business with for a very long time. And they'll stack rank the letter grades of those companies and look for the ones that have the C's or the D's or the F's. Now, the beauty of what we do is our intention is to not call out a company's bad security. You have an F. That doesn't mean that, we drop everything and disconnect that vendor. Security scorecard is designed in a way to help coach a company to get to an A. So and within the platform, we've built in a collaboration workflow that allows our customers to invite any of their vendors or partners to security scorecard so that they can provide them with equivalent level of visibility. When the vendor comes into security scorecard, they get to see their score. They can claim their profile, they can see their score, and this is all at no cost. Now the vendor sees that they don't have an A, and that's of course of concern. And as I mentioned, they can unpack that letter grade and understand, well, what's causing me to not have an A? What do I need to fix to be best in class? And the scorecard platform provides them with what we call the hero's journey. It's almost like we lay out the yellow brick road to good security for any company. And the net effect of that is when our customers are empowering Security Scorecard into the hands of their vendors, that inherently drives accountability. That basically says, hey, I'm watching you continuously, and there are probably other customers of you that are also in Security Scorecard watching you continuously. You need to take ownership of your scorecard. You need to maintain the A. And when the vendors know that they're being watched and monitored, there's some social pressure. They're being held accountable, and they start fixing their score. The net effect is folks in security teams feel like they've regained some of that control and visibility, and they've de-risked any concern they have throughout their ecosystem.
That's terrific. Thanks very much, Sam. That's really, really helpful. And so let me just quickly turn back to Derek and Adriana with regards to the question I asked you to think about a moment ago, and people involved in the assessment process, other departments and or individuals. Do you feel like you've kind of fully covered that, or would you like to go in a little bit more in depth into who gets involved in these, the decision-making process in terms of evaluating suppliers?
Oh, sure. I'll take that one. This is Adriana. All of those areas that you mentioned are involved in virtually every assessment that we review. So we have individuals from the business area because they understand the business process that they're looking to source. They're our key contacts to really understand why we're looking to move this data to a different outside third party. Procurement obviously is involved. We're embedded within their overall end-to-end process, and they remain involved throughout, and they should, so that they understand where things stand and some of the challenges or considerations that we're discussing. And then obviously Derek and my team are involved in all of these. The only situation I will offer that privacy is not involved, if there is an exchange of data but it doesn't involve personal information, then privacy does take a backseat, and information security primarily drives those assessment reviews and approvals. Does that help?
Yes, very much so. Derek, did you have any follow-on comments? Or?
No, that's spot on.
Okay, terrific. Let me move on. Before I do, let me say that we have a huge number of excellent questions here, and in the allotted time left, we're not going to be able to handle them all. But I wanted to let everybody on the call know that we're going to actually export these questions and anonymously post them with answers on the Security Scorecard website following the webinar. Obviously, it'll take some time to collate those answers. But know that if we're not able to get your question answered on the program here today, to make sure to check back on the Security Scorecard website, and we will have answers for you there. Let me just tackle another one quickly here. A number of people were asking about the services provided by large cloud service providers as opposed to other smaller vendors. Are there any differences that you guys might want to highlight with regards to AWS or other big cloud providers as opposed to smaller shops? Big differences in contracts there? Anything you look for in particular?
So that's actually an excellent question. I know Allstate isn't the only company going through this big push to move to AWS. We're going through that. Office 365, we're seeing a lot of that. From a process perspective, what we're noticing is Microsoft, AWS, the whole process that we described, they're not willing to go through that. They will offer different attestations, SOC 2s, external attestations, but what we've noticed from information security, and I also believe privacy, is they're not willing to play nice and complete these questionnaires. Microsoft did for us, Amazon wouldn't. So if someone was saying, you know, what to expect that they're going to really push to say, we will give you documentation, we're not going to fill out anything from you.
Yeah, so that makes good sense, Derek, and that's really quite interesting. So the process is going to vary. You know, smaller shops that are maybe hungry for the business are going to be much more willing to work to the standards and be willing to go through the exercise than some of the larger businesses that have enough business to keep them busy. They don't feel like they need to necessarily comply to the request. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. And it's just not cloud service providers, the big banks, Bank of America, your Microsoft, Oracles. They don't like to fill out questionnaires either. They will try to provide. What we did is we have a procurement risk committee. Every time somebody says they don't want to fill this out, it's fed to the procurement risk committee. That's made up of senior business leaders. They are then going to decide what they provided, is it good enough for Allstate, or if we're going to pick another supplier.
That's great. And, you know, here's a follow-up question that's somewhat related. It's kind of interesting, I think, jurisdictionally. Are there any differences in terms of dealing with processors or resources that are processing the information offshore in other political and legal jurisdictions? And how does that factor into the assessment process?
This is Adriana. There absolutely are, and we definitely consider that, and it's something we're going through right now with all of these legal landscapes changing, with GDPR for the European Union coming into play. It's something that we currently handle on a case-by-case basis. There are certain stances that companies can take. For example, we can say that we will not do business with any supplier that has an economic sanction against them. So there are some steps you can take to limit your exposure. But for us, it's on a case-by-case basis, and absolutely those different regulations do come into play. And as I was speaking earlier about your risk tolerance level, I think that's a conversation that senior leadership needs to have around what you're willing to do with your data and where you're willing to send it, store it, process it, et cetera.
Okay, terrific. Let's see, there's so much. We probably have time for about one more question here. There's just so much to address. Here's a good one that's just very straightforward and logistical. What's the kind of, if there is, a typical timeline of request from business to implementation of new vendor? You know, about approximately how long does that process take?
Okay, so we just, for information, it's a great question. We just got this data, very timely question. End to end, Allstate, from the time the business approaches till the contract is executed, we're coming in at, on average, 81 days. Our industry average is 87 days. So just so you kind of, we're doing well. Another insurance company who's actually mentored us on this process, they're the only ones ahead of us. They're at 72 days, but for Allstate, end-to-end, 81 days.
And I'll offer up that, it's a very complex process that you're going through. We're one piece of that overall process. But it's important to give the appropriate due diligence, but we always are looking for ways to improve our processes, make it more efficient, and cut down on time when we can. And in certain cases, there are expedited requests that come in, and we work very diligently to meet those expectations and those expedited timelines. But the process was designed to allow for the appropriate due diligence for each of these contracts.
Well, that makes good sense. And, approximately 3 months may sound like a long time, but if you're talking about going through a very rigorous exercise with a vendor that you may have around for a long time, it certainly makes sense to invest that time and effort up front and then secure a quality partner for the long term rather than not do due diligence and run serious problems that need to be unwound later, right?
Yeah, I think if you asked our leaders, they're very happy at the 81 days.
Yeah.
So we're getting the right level of due diligence. It's giving them the comfort they want, and we're still executing contracts. We're not slowing down the speed of business.
Terrific. Well, that's about all the time that we have for the questions. We're just at the top of the hour now. I want to thank you, Sam and Derek and Adriana, for that terrific program. Lots of valuable information. I hope that those of you that dialed into the call today really found what you were looking for by spending the time with us. A couple of reminders. One, we had a whole bunch of great questions that we just didn't have the time to address, but we're going to export them and provide some written answers to them as possible, which will be posted on the SecurityScorecard website in the near term. And also a recording of this program is being made, and that's going to be posted on the IAPP website and available free to registrants of this program within about 48 hours. And so a big, big thank you to our presenters today, to the SecurityScorecard for making this program available for free to the audience. Really appreciate the support there. And if you can take literally just 2 minutes and click on that live link in front of you, it's a 2-minute survey that we use to see if we're meeting expectations for these educational programs. We certainly hope we are. We are always seeking to improve. So if you can let us know if we met your expectations by clicking on that link and giving us an evaluation of your experience today, we'd really appreciate that. Importantly, there's also a field there where you can let us know what topics you'd like to hear about on future IAPP web conferences. So if you could fill that in for us, that would be great, and we will work hard to see if we can bring those topics to you. As I mentioned at the top of the program, if you're an IAPP certified privacy professional, you will receive 1 CPE credit toward the upkeep of your certification, and that will be granted to you automatically on our end just by registering for the program. But if for some reason you're listening to this recording or attended the live event and didn't actually fill in the form to register, you can still receive that credit by going to that live link in front of you there that says Submit CPE Credits. And by clicking on that link, you can fill out a very quick form and get that credit to help with the upkeep of your certification. If you're an attorney and you're wondering about continuing legal education or CLE credits, they may or may not be available for this program. We don't pre-certify the programs because we can't do that in all the various jurisdictions for the vast number of programs that we produce here. But they are often eligible for CLEs in various states. So you'll need to apply to your particular bar, and if you need supporting materials for that, please feel free to contact me directly. You can either give me a phone call or shoot me an email. Some jurisdictions want a copy of the slides or program outlines, speaker biographies, etc., and I will do my best to provide those supporting materials for your CLE application. Of course, please feel free to contact me with anything else regarding these programs. Happy to help. And once again, thank you all for joining us today, and hope to have you with us on